So the retailers and food service industry as well, they're seeing high costs for everything. So even though their wholesale meat price has dropped, they're resisting dropping their sticker price to the consumer because they're paying higher prices for labor, for fuel, for shipping, and because everyone got kind of beat up through COVID. So if there's a margin there today for our end user, they're holding on to it.
Welcome to MeatsPad, a platform dedicated to sharing breakthrough knowledge that is accessible to the meats industry. On each episode, we will hear from meat specialists and professionals to talk about numerous topics in meat science. This podcast is brought to you by the U.S. Meat Export Federation, UltraSource, the new standard for innovation,
IFA, Meat Processing Power.
Viscofan is a global leader and innovative partner in the food industry who provides solutions for the casing market.
Hello, my folks. Welcome back to the Inside Podcast. Today we continue here at the Reciprocal Meat Conference 2022 here in Des Moines, Iowa. On day 3, we continue these conversations with meat industry leaders. Today, it's an honor to have our friend Erin Borror, Vice President of Economic Analysis at the United States Meat Export Federation. We're a partner of this podcast, and we're talking how this started earlier with Gerardo, Lorenzo, and Cynthia back in Mexico, and how this idea of starting to translate some of that content in the meat science community, meat processing community into Spanish. Welcome, Erin. How are you?
Yeah, I'm great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad that at least this is your 5th podcast. You've done a lot of things virtually, so I'm glad that we're the official first in-person podcast that you have participated in.
Indeed. Yes. So exciting to be in person.
So tell me about your presentation tomorrow. You were telling about your agenda. It's going to be mainly pork. And I think this conversation was overdue, talking about the economics. Sometimes we don't talk much about it, and we focus on meat science and meat processing and I mean, you name it, everything processing. But I think it's good to have an update on the world economics, talking about the world meat industry. So tell me a little bit about your talk tomorrow. Maybe don't give a lot of information, but I think general overview. What are you presenting on?
Yeah, sure. So it's a challenging situation out there, economically speaking, but I am going to set the landscape for where the U.S. fits for the world pork situation. And it is, I would say, an optimistic outlook, recognizing we have some challenges kind of at the doorstep. But maybe most importantly, pork production for the top exporters is actually decreasing. So Europe, most importantly, U.S., Canada, all seeing a bit less pork produced this year, except Brazil, and there's growth in Brazil. But for 3 out of the top 4 major exporters, we're seeing a decrease in production. And I wouldn't say that's good, except given the economic situation globally, it's actually better to be going into this challenge with a bit tighter supplies. And you wouldn't want a glut of pork as we start going into consumers tightening belts around the world. And so we're still seeing some challenges on pricing. So it's an inflation-driven, landscape at the moment. That's the top of everyone's minds, including policymakers. But if we look at the wholesale prices for U.S. beef and pork, they're actually down 20% year on year. And we're still above 2019 levels by 20 to 30%, so above that pre-pandemic level. But our wholesale prices, not retail, have dropped significantly from the highs of last year. And at the same time, our costs of production, so for everything, for feed, for labor, for transport, all of it, energy, obviously, are sharply higher. And so I think at this time, it is as important or more important than ever that we have the export side firing on all cylinders, because that's how we add and maximize the value of every animal we produce. And also at a time where the global economic situation, it really varies depending on where you are. So the war in Ukraine impacts everyone differently. High oil and energy prices impact differently. The inflation situation is a bit different in every market. And so being able to have access to every consumer, or not every, but as many consumers as possible around the world is in our best interest to be able to, again, get the best price we can for every item on that hog. And so that brings us to what's happening in the importers side of the equation. And on the production side, China is the big swing player. They're the biggest pork producer in the world, biggest consumer. And their production is or has been increasing. We know they came out of that ASF hole. And so that's been the big change really over the past year. So since since June of last year, was China's strong herd rebuild. And so they went from being the huge mover on bigger volumes of pork traded around the world to China kind of escaping or exiting, I should say, the market. And that meant more European product flowing into all of our markets, is the way I look at it. And so we've had a hard time competing with cheaper European product. And at this point, China is still taking a much lower volume of pork than they did during the shortage days. And that looks like it's going to continue, although we think that has bottomed out. So China's lower import volumes, we probably have seen the bottom. And that probably bottomed out in like April, May, June as we speak. But we think that decrease in imports or exports has probably reached its bottom. And so the good news is we should start to see, maybe not until the end of the year, but we should start to see China come back into the market, and that will add some support to prices. And maybe not even for the US first, but for Europe, and that helps take European product out of our markets because they've been competing at a lower price level. And so it's a bit tricky to explain, but basically you had China buying more from everybody, and that was supporting prices. And then China's demand dropped potentially by as much as like 1 million tons. And so a huge decrease in Chinese demand. That meant product, especially from Europe, flowed into all of the other markets in the world. So mostly in Asia, places like the Philippines, but even Korea, Japan, Taiwan. We're taking more European product at a cheaper price than our exporters. It was like below our exporters' cost. And so luckily, US, we were able to grow strongly into Latin America, to Mexico especially. And that helped to offset the decrease in Chinese demand. And we're a bit insulated from European competition within Latin America because of our trade agreements and also our proximity. And so places like Mexico has been taking 9 to 10% of our production every month since last August. And that's kind of another interesting part of the balance sheet, if you will, on the importing country side. They have also seen maybe steady to less pork production. So the pandemic had a big impact before we even get into war in Ukraine. And so Mexico has also had some productivity challenges like we have in the US and Canada. Everyone's been battling some of these kind of local disease issues like PRRS and PED and such. But that's meant some tightness in supplies, and Mexico has had a strong demand for our product to fill their need. And then we don't talk a lot about poultry. That's USAPEC's purview, right. But poultry supplies are super tight. So Mexico has been able to import less poultry from the U.S., and so there's a need for that affordable protein in the Mexican market, and that's helping to continue to drive those large U.S. exports of pork to Mexico, week in and week out. And again, that has, to a large degree, offset the decrease in U.S. exports to China. And luckily, China and Mexico actually buy similar products. So Mexico, we know, is a chilled, bone-in ham combos, that are trucked south, where for China, we have to pack and freeze, box that product to ship to China. But China also buys hams and picnics like Mexico. And then they also both buy the variety meats. So China's our biggest variety meat market. So talking feet, stomachs, heads.
Yeah,
offal. Yep. And Mexico is number 2. So those two markets are very different, but they're actually similar in some of those items that they take. So having the strong demand in Mexico has been absolutely critical for our pork.
The mission of USMEF is to increase the value and profitability of the U.S. beef, pork, and lamb industries by enhancing demand for their products in export markets through a dynamic partnership of all stakeholders. Simply put, USMEF is putting U.S. meat on the world's table.
So when you when you're saying European countries, are you focusing mostly on the Nordic region, Denmark, or are you Germany? They produce the majority of the pork in Europe, correct? Those Nordic regions.
Yeah, so we do. We kind of overgeneralize, and we shouldn't overgeneralize Europe because of the African swine fever situation. So it's actually even more complex, in my mind anyway, what's happening in Europe now because of African swine fever. And so Germany has historically been the largest producer and exporter out of Europe, and now Spain is surpassing them. So Spanish production has been growing strongly for years. I mean, they've had some kind of setbacks here and there, but generally growing. And that's in contrast to the situation in Germany. And Germany's production it was in decline even before they found ASF in September of 2020. But when Germany got ASF, that was, kind of the death knell to the industry that was already facing high costs for environmental requirements, high costs for animal welfare. And they had some changes on the labor side too. So Germany historically had plant labor cost advantages, and that has gone away. A 30% increase in the minimum wage, all of this. So cost increases dramatically. And then the export side, they can export some. They have access to a few markets that have regionalized. So it's not zero, certainly, but their exports are heavily restricted because they did lose access to China, ironically, because China has ASF, and into Japan, Korea, like all of the higher value markets in Asia as well. And so Germany's pretty limited on where they can export. And so especially, again, for these variety meats, I was talking to a German producer at Pork Expo, and he was telling me that they have to pay to have the variety meats or offal rendered because they've lost those export markets like China. So their producers are, it kind of breaks your heart because we never like to see producers suffer, and they're having one heck of a rough time. So a big decrease in German output. Again, Spain's hog slaughter has been running up year on year to date, but it looks like now that the growth in Spanish production is not going to be able to offset the decrease in not only Germany, but also Netherlands, Belgium, some other important producer and exporters that are also expected to see less production. And then you mentioned Denmark. Denmark is another power player on the export front, especially. And they had a big decrease in sow numbers in, I think, their April inventory, down more than 5%. So Denmark has historically shipped a lot of piglets into Germany in the past for further fattening and slaughter in Germany. And obviously with ASF, that changed everything. So Denmark is being impacted as well. So for us, we look at the future demand for U.S. pork as only growing because Europe, again, is our biggest competitor when you look at them all together. And it's just a super challenging environment for production in Europe. They get 40% of their feed imports from Ukraine. And so feed costs have accelerated.
And that's the other topic I was going to ask you. After COVID, it seems like it's been one thing after another. So drastically has impacted meat prices. And we're talking about that. Without going and just saying too much, what's your take or your expectations from future meat prices?
Yeah, meat prices. So this is where it gets a little bit
cloudy.
Well, I wouldn't even say that. It's everything is kind of indirect. So, and it depends on what we're talking about. Okay, so for retail meat prices, they're basically at all-time highs. But the wholesale price, so the packer FOB price, is down 20% year on year. So it's an important differentiation because the producer is seeing lower prices and the retail or the consumer is seeing record high prices. So the retailers and food service industry as well, they're seeing high costs for everything. So even though their wholesale meat price has dropped, they're resisting dropping their sticker price to the consumer because they're paying higher prices for labor, for fuel, for shipping, and because everyone got kind of beat up through COVID. So if there's a margin there today for our end user, they're holding on to it. And there's some funky stuff that always goes on in the meat case, you can argue that they're subsidizing one meat product with a price on another, and how I don't know how all of that works exactly, but it is important to note that the consumer is paying essentially all-time high prices, but the producer is receiving lower prices. And so for the meat industry, we don't just pass on higher costs. That's not how it works. In agriculture, we're price takers. So say as a hog producer or a cattle producer, my costs of production are sharply higher because I also pay for gas, diesel, shipping on everything. It is going up, it's hitting new highs for feed, for labor. All of my costs are, essentially record high. But the price I'm getting is now lower than it was. So the way it works is then you see that price squeeze on the producer, and the packers are in different situations, depending on the species, but packer margins are shrinking as well. And so again, that passes back a lower price for the animal. Yeah. So then it takes a supply response to be able to pass on a higher cattle, hog, beef, pork price. So what should happen is we see a decrease in production to be able to pass on higher costs. So it's a bit messy, and it takes a while for these things to cycle out. But that's why in the beginning I was saying it's actually not a bad thing that we do see smaller production already, because it puts us in a bit better footing to be able to pass on higher costs.
So and on the less product out there, the higher the price would be.
Yep.
Yeah, it's economics 101. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, and on the beef side, I mean, we have this drought situation, right? So beef cow herd peaked in 2019. We had kind of modest liquidation in 20. Last year, it accelerated. And then so far this year, significantly higher cow slaughter, running up 15, 20%. And so USDA has a sharp decrease in U.S. beef production penciled in for next year. So not now. We still have some hard times as far as having near record production and a challenged consumer at the moment. But then next year, a significant reduction in beef output, again, which sets you up a bit better to be able to pass on those higher costs.
I'd like to have you back and because I don't want to go any longer, because I know you're busy. There's sessions going on, but I definitely would like to have a part 2 on this to touch more on the last part of this episode, because you said everything has to cycle out, and it's going to take maybe 1 or 2 years for all this to stabilize more, and who knows what's going to happen with other things like they're not tangible, that you don't see until it happens. Like example, COVID, example, situation in Russia. But thank you a lot for joining us today. Today is a day where we're having a short series of women in the meat industry, and I think this is a great, because you see a lot of the sessions out there, all grad students. Do you have any thoughts on recommendations how to keep them motivated to wrap up this episode?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, it was just my sister and I, and raised on a cow-calf operation. So my dad taught us and treated us like boys, is the way I look at it, meaning that there was nothing that we couldn't do. And there were many times I wished I had more muscles to be able to, pull the hay out of the swather that I jammed up. But I think that empowered my sister and I. She's a large animal vet and a human nutritionist as well. And so we just gender was never a thing. And that confidence has just been the drive. And as a mother of 2 boys, I've lived the challenges of, oh my gosh, how do you do this? So it's not easy, but my strong family behind me. So my husband, my mother and father-in-law, my parents are not close, but thankfully my mother and father-in-law are close. And so they've been a godsend. And my husband will just take the boys, do whatever he has to do to allow me to do what I love doing. And so it takes a village. It takes all of our good friends as well. But you just don't even consider the gender. And as I've been told by those that I look up to, we're women. We just do it. So I know a lot of leaders in ag that are women, and that's what they've told me is you just it doesn't necessarily get easier because then those kids get involved in everything. But yeah, somehow, good Lord willing, we just make it happen.
All right. Well, thank you for your kind words. And regardless of gender, everything is possible. So thank you a lot for joining us today. I hope to have you back sometime soon, and appreciate your time.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.